Okay. So I can just start whenever I want. Okay. I affirm the resolution that the People's Republic of China should abolish all restrictions on internal migration. So let's get into definitions first. What are these restrictions on internal migration? We say that they're anything that restricts people within China from moving to and from other areas in China, specifically people moving from rural areas to urban areas. And the current restrictions that exist are mainly two. So one is this home buying registration thing. So if you live in like urban or rural China, for example, and you want to buy a house in urban China, you have to like register where you currently live. This means that everybody who is like an out of towner in certain Chinese cities are denied access to like being able to buy housing in those cities. And then you might be thinking, okay, what about living with relatives or things like that? And so people in China can get migration work permits that usually exist for 6 to 12 months. So if you live in urban or rural China and you want to live with your aunt in urban China, you can get this permit for 6 to 12 months. However, these permanent permits are usually only given to people who are highly educated or people with family in cities, which is a very small percentage of people in rural China. So let's get into the government plan. The government plan is to lift all restrictions on internal migration by 2030. We don't think that this should be a hasty thing, especially with COVID right now. So we're saying that they can lift them gradually, but by 2030, all of them will be lifted. And we believe that you should be weighing this round on net benefits. What does the most amount of good for the most amount of people? The government has two advantages that I will get into now. The first advantage is that this would allow people living in rural China a higher quality of life. There's a few things we can see in the status quo. The first thing we can see in the status quo is that the quality of life in rural China is bad. We can break this down into 3 different categories. The first is jobs and income. There's a great income inequality between rural China and urban China, and this income inequality is growing. People living in urban China earn on average 43,800 yuan every year in 2020, while rural residents averaged 17,000 yuan in 2020. The second reason is that education is inaccessible. There are more than 61 million kids living in rural China. However, 59 million of them do not attend school. This means only 2 million of the kids in rural China are attending school and getting any sort of education. And the last thing is that there's lower access to things like utilities in rural China, which means that these people are more vulnerable to drastic temperature changes, especially with climate change. This is a growing issue, as well as access to things like clean running water. The second thing we can see in the status quo is that urban China has opportunities. There are actually a labor shortage within urban China, and there is a 30 to 70% gap between the amount of workers demanded and the workers available in cities like Shanghai. We also see that in cities like Shanghai, there are a lot more education opportunities, and there are better utilities when it comes to like air conditioning and running water, because you have that city infrastructure and it's already built up. Whereas in rural China, it's just simply not built yet. So what happens when this plan passes? The first thing that happens is that people are able to migrate if they want to. The second thing that happens is that we see better opportunities for people who are living in rural China. If they want to, they can decide to move to a city in China and fill one of these labor shortages and make better wages there. Their children can also get an education. So hopefully their children can climb the socioeconomic ladder and no longer live in these like working class jobs that are probably not that great. And these people have access to things like utilities more often, and they don't have to worry about like dying of heat stroke because it's too hot and they don't have running water and air conditioning. And the third thing that happens is that we see that urban China also sees a more flourishing economy because their labor shortage is filled. Now companies in urban China can function at their full capacity, and firms don't have to worry about closing because of labor shortages or anything like that. that, and they can just be more efficient and sell their goods on a global market at more ease. So the impact of this is we see an increased quality of life for people living currently in rural China, and we see a more booming Chinese economy. The second advantage of the government is that removing internal migration restrictions gives migrants urban benefits. There's a few things we can see in the status quo. The first thing we can see in the status quo is that the current hukou resident registration system, which I spoke about earlier, determines Chinese people's access to social security benefits. Basically, people have to list whether or not they originally lived in a rural or urban area because they ask for your legal address. The second thing we can see in the status quo is that this means that rural migrants that move to urban China and live under this temporary work permit thing are not counted under this system. They're not considered residents of urban China because China wants to restrict this internal migration. So even if they physically live in urban China, they don't have access to these benefits. The third thing that we can see in the status quo is that these benefits are very essential, but they are only given to people that live in these urban areas. These are things like access to public education, unemployment insurance, health insurance, maternity benefits, etc. And it's basically impossible to apply for these if you are not originally an urbanite. And the fourth thing we can see in the status quo is that the vast majority of migrants living in urban China, because of this, live in extreme poverty. This is because they don't have access to social mobility that these social safety nets enable. So what happens when this plan passes? The first thing that happens is that all these restrictions, like the hukou system, are lifted. The second thing that happens is that migrants who physically move to urban China, they don't have their access to benefits restricted, so they have access to these social benefits like unemployment insurance, etc. And this makes it easier for them to find good jobs because they have something, to cushion them while they're searching and while they're making this life transition. So the impact of this is a higher quality of life for migrants who live in urban China or who want to live in urban China. So for all of those reasons, I urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Sorry. Any POIs I'll take verbally. I use she, her pronouns. And if everybody is ready, then I will begin my time now. I'm going to go op case and gov case, starting with an observation and then 3 contentions. And then I'm just going to go af in order. Okay. First of all, it's sort of observation, not really a counter plan because it already exists, but also what the alternative is, right? We tell you that China allows a lot of external migration, just not internal, right? They send rural workers who don't have jobs to other countries, like places in Africa and factories and things like this, right? We think that if we continue promoting this, rural workers are still going to be able to get jobs in other places that just don't have to be the urban areas of China. We agree with their framing that this is going to cause mass urbanization. We're going to tell you why we think this is probably net bad. While they are sending workers to other places and there are jobs becoming available for Chinese workers, just not in the urban centers of China, right? So we agree that there's going to be a mass urbanization when this happens. And our first contention is why urbanization is bad for rural communities. A is moving of talent. We tell you that the types of people that are generally able to move to urban areas and find jobs and have a good quality of life are going to be skilled laborers, doctors, and other talents and things like that, right? Generally unskilled labor forces are super oversaturated through the labor population that already exists in urban cities. And people can get migration work permits for 6 to 12 months, but permits are only given to well-educated people, a point that my opponents point out as well. I think that this is probably bad because then rural populations will have far fewer people like lawyers, doctors, etc., that they need to keep their own communities functioning as well. It's also bad because the workers who are moving there are becoming to a lower quality of life and are super open to mistreatment, while skilled laborers in rural China are super important to the community and are likely treated better, making more money, etc. Second is moving of income earners. We tell you that the people able to move to cities and buy capital and things like that generally have a way higher income than those that make up the rural poor. This is because moving to industrialized places in mass amounts generally takes more money and you need capital. So we think that the people who were previously paying more tax money in rural areas are no longer doing that, and the general value of the area decreases significantly. The fact that there are less taxpayers and less taxpayers with more capital in this area and paying tax money that is then going back to those communities is going to be significantly decreased if they're moving to urban areas as well. Third is political power. We tell you that I'll take it at the end of this contention. We tell you that like less people, but also less powerful people living in urban areas generally results in them having like way less sway in the government, especially for rural towns and autocratic regimes like China, right? Like Xi is way less likely to care or put any sort of social capital into rural populations. There aren't that many people living there, and that therefore he has way more like incentive to put it into like an urban population instead, and like way overextend himself. The rural population is going to be negatively affected because there's not going to be many people living there, and therefore he probably won't care. I think that a mass drain of people from rural populations means that rural populations take a longer time to get social services, etc., because they don't have enough. Also, skilled workers migrated is probably bad for rural communities. I'll take your POI.
Can you explain how the taxation system in China works and how like taxes are collected and distributed?
I don't know specifically about the tax system in China, but like generally the way in which this works is that taxes are collected from a certain population, and then that sort of money goes to the government, in which is then given back to the certain populations in which it comes from. We also think that this point still stands even if it just goes to general populations, because as I said, they have less political capital, less people living there, way less likely to get social services. Second contention is that urbanization is bad for cities, right? We think there's going to be a mass influx of like unskilled workers from rural areas, which is just increasing the amount of workers that are in cities. This is bad for everybody, right? Like people already in cities are facing new competition for their jobs. Some are probably losing jobs, but also there's just a huge oversaturation of the workforce. Labor is a market like any other, right? Increased supply without increased demand means that labor prices, aka wages, drop. This is bad. This is especially bad for rural farmers traditionally earning way less. They accept a farmer salary in city, then city people lose their jobs and everybody gets paid less. This is a decreased quality of life for like everybody involved. Living costs are also currently rising, so this is like uniquely harmful in the status quo. There's also already not enough jobs to keep up with China's huge population, and unemployment is up 5.5% literally last month. Like it rose 5.5% in the last month. Like this is a huge increase. They don't need more workers.
Point of information.
The biggest. I'm sorry. Did you
You
say
have
point of? Oh, I don't have time. I'm sorry. China also has one of the biggest populations in the world, and this is just continuing to grow. We think this oversaturation will only continue if they abolish this now, and then like future generations are also moving. It's just going to continue this sort of cycle. It's also going to strain public resources because it's more people in the same amount of jobs, but way lower wages, right? So we tell you that it's harder to maintain public transportation, schools, hospitals, and government-funded programs, and most I'm sorry, more people using these programs generally just puts a strain on the system, right? I think that like the more people that are concentrated in this urban area, the more strain the government is going to be under to provide social services to all of these people. It's going to put the government under significantly more strain, which is decreasing social services in urban populations as well. This is bad not only for the people that are then moving to the urban populations, but the people that are already living there. Third contention is that external migration is probably better than internal, which is what's uniquely happening on our side when internal migration like isn't allowed, right? I think this is probably good for China because A, there's not generally enough jobs in China for everybody to work, while China is like building infrastructure in other places, even though nobody wants to live there because they have too many laborers, right? After economic reforms in 1978, China began to promote the export of labor as a means to earn foreign exchange and ease domestic unemployment, right? Like China is doing this to like combat their oversaturated workforce. And it's also making China like a lot of money. Like foreign projects generated $8 billion for China like recently, right? This is making China a lot of money. Having this external migration is super like popular for the city, and also dealing with all of the unemployment problems I give you like in previous contentions. Secondly is money. Once again, we tell you this is generating a lot of capital, which is like way more likely to be used for the citizens as well. It's better that China has like a more thriving economy. It's way more likely that citizens get some of that money. They're also building infrastructure there and continue to do so, like places where the Belt and Road Initiative are happening, usually way less developed for China, which means the potential for infrastructure is huge, all without the benefits to urban communities. We also think this is probably good for the countries that it's happening in as well because of the industrialization and the trade connections that they get with China when it is happening. This creates like net benefits for everybody involved and is like uniquely more promoted on our side. Moving on to my opponent's case, their first contention that the quality of life in rural areas is bad, right? We first of all like tell you that first of all, this is probably because of things like skilled laborers leaving rural China, which gets uniquely worse on their side, right? Like farmers in the status quo don't have the income to move to large cities without being like unemployed or looking for unskilled laboring jobs. And Gov needs a plan for how these people are going to afford it, right? Like we think the Gov plan will largely only impact the remaining skilled workers in rural areas because those are the only ones that have the ability to move. And those that don't have the ability to move are going to move to urban areas, not be able to get a job, and thus their quality of life will decrease when they like could have continued farming, right? We also tell you that the amount of unskilled labor in rural China is far greater than the labor shortage that they point out, right? We think this will probably get significantly worse in the long term when, as they say, this unskilled labor population is going to move to urban areas, have more children, which are also going to need these unskilled labor and jobs, et cetera, et cetera. This is going to get worse in the long term. We also tell you that the labor shortages generally have to do with ageism, which we tell you will likely, like their plan will likely increase this problem, which has longer term impacts of like increasing ageism in China and like the possibility of this continuing further. While the long term impacts on their side will likely be a continued mass urbanization. So even if we solve the labor shortage in the very short term, this labor program like still has the negative effects when new generations come around, and it will have all of the negative effects that we tell you. Their second contention was like what's happening in the status quo. They tell you that like rural areas don't have access to things. We tell you this gets so much worse if more people move. The reason the government does this is so that they have to spend less money. They won't want to spend more. This likely means that they'll cut funding to urban areas as well when they see that they have to spend more money there. And they give no plan as to why this is like somehow going to help rural areas if we like get rid of this, how they'll get access to social services. All these reasons I urge an off ballot. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Kai Taigen, the second speaker for the government. Verbal POIs, if there are any. Okay. So I will start my time now, beginning on the opposition case, on the observation that China allows external migration and is sending people to Africa, and all these people are so happy about it. This doesn't really make sense. We have quite a few responses. Response number one, people don't want to leave, right? Partially because there's a massive economic boom happening in China. That's not specifically urban China. That's not happening everywhere, right? Like if you are forced to move to a place that has no infrastructure, that has no employment, that is already like overloaded with labor as it is, that's not going to be good for you. And second, people don't want to leave their country because that's an extreme culture shock. These people have lived in this country their entire life. It is entirely unreasonable to say, hey, if you're a farmer in rural China and you're not happy, you can't come to the city for a job where everyone is going to speak your language and have a similar culture. Instead, we're going to send you to Latin America where you have to relearn all of your customs and feel like an outsider for your entire life. That doesn't make sense. So on this next point that urbanization is bad, right? They say for a start that that people shouldn't be moving to urban China because there's a labor surplus, right? This is a direct contradiction. This is a direct clash with what we're saying. Again, we tell you, and they actually concede later on the government case, like watch this. I'm going to point this out when I get to this. They concede that there is a labor shortage. They do, because they're saying, let me see, I don't have the direct quote, but they're like, oh, the labor shortage is as a result of ageism, which is them conceding there's a labor shortage, right? If you can see that there is a labor shortage, then you can see that actually there's benefit to moving to these urban centers because there are a lot of jobs. Also warrant that there's a lot of jobs because there's a lot of capital in these urban centers. Investors are investing in these urban centers. The Chinese government is investing in these urban centers in a way that they just aren't investing in rural China. People want to move here because they can get jobs. They say that only talented people can move are going to move under the government plan from rural China to urban China. But what we're seeing in the status quo is that like actually that is the status quo, because the issue is twofold, right? Number one, it's kind of hard to physically move, but more importantly, number two, to legally move to a place, that means you need hukou residence. Like you're not considered a resident unless you are able to fill out your hukou forms. And the only people who can actually get those approved by the government are high skill workers. Under the government plan and the government plan alone, low skill workers will be able to actually get legal residency in these urban centers and entirely legally move, right? Like hukou is the biggest internal migration restriction that we are talking about, and that goes entirely uncontested. Our entire second contention about hukou not even responded to by side opposition, and this is going to be incredibly important. Again, like there are a lot of low-skill jobs especially available in urban China. China has a massive manufacturing sector, and most of the labor shortage is people who need to work in that manufacturing sector. There will be plenty of employment available. Then they say, oh, all the rich people are going to leave the rural areas, and that's going to hurt taxes. So for a start, there were never rich people in urban China. That's part of the reason that capital hasn't been invested there, right? Like they need to prove that the rural countryside is some magical place that is only getting worse because all the rich people who supposedly live there are deciding to move to the cities. But the fact of the matter matter is, rural China has always been populated by people who are poor, people who don't have jobs, people who don't have access to capital, and that's why there's no development there. That's why there's not access to clean running water in many of those areas. In fact, 50% of the people in northwest rural China have an average income far below the national median, far below the national average, the national mean. That's an issue, right? These areas were never rich. These areas never had taxes funding their schools. I mean, like, cross-reference what my partner said about the fact that there are very few schools in rural China, and part of the reason why is because they were never funded in the first place. Opposition is creating a problem that just doesn't exist. So then they say that rural areas will have less sway in the government. Like right now, the rich people who live in the rural areas are going to lobby the government for more capital. But again, the fact that there is so little capital, which goes pretty much uncontested in the rural areas, shows there are no rich people living there in the first place. They have no political will in the first place. And the only real way for people's quality of life to be improved is for them to have the access to move to the places with the jobs and where the government is actually paying attention. So then they say, they talk about urbanization is bad for cities. They say this is going to massively increase the workers in cities. So for a start, like, the world they paint where there are all these workers in the cities and like, no one has access to benefits and quality of life is really poor for all those workers because it's just like, because of like overcrowding. It's actually more the scenario right now, because what you need to understand is already a lot of people have physically moved from rural China to urban China because it is so much better, but they haven't been able to legally move because of the hukou system, right? Only by removing the hukou system can we make sure that the tens of thousands of rural Chinese who've already moved to urban China but who aren't considered residents, who haven't considered to be legally moved because of this internal migration restriction, will actually have access to incredibly important social safety benefits, like healthcare, right? Like public education. This is huge. That's the only way we can make the quality of life for these people better. And Side Opposition just has no real way to contest this, and doesn't really contest this at all because they don't even address our entire contention about the hukou system. So then they say that external migration is better. So we say a few things, right? Like, first off, external migration is not better because of the culture shock thing. But second, they're trying to equate external migration and exporting of labor with exporting of capital. What they're talking about is China developing projects in other countries by exporting capital, by putting in money there. And exporting capital is different from putting in labor, right? Like, the Belt and Road Initiative is not a thing where, oh, China gives you all of their surplus workers, go wild. It's like, no, China gives you money to develop projects that then your workers can get jobs at, right? So this whole idea that China for a really long time has been like just shuttling out workers and that everyone loves it is just not true. People wouldn't appreciate if they're already struggling economies where they already have mass employment on their own domestic population is suddenly filled with rural Chinese people. Rural Chinese people won't appreciate having to change their entire culture, and the Chinese government will not appreciate that the people who could have been filling their sector, their labor shortage, are instead moving to other places. They say like, oh, people can send money back, but remittances are not a mandatory thing. They're voluntary, and I would argue that rural Chinese people who are bitter with the Chinese government that has never paid attention to their needs are going to send their entire paycheck back to that Chinese government. So, on the government case, the first contention is the quality of life in rural China is so bad because skilled laborers are leaving rural China. But again, like, cross-reference what we said about education, right? There is no access to education, even elementary school, public education in rural China because there's no capital there. There's no development. There is no access for high-skilled people to have ever lived in rural China. So then they say the unskilled labor is worse in rural there's a shortage. Again, like, not everyone is going to move. They also like create this scenario where it's like, oh, all of a sudden everyone who lives in rural China is just going to immediately move. Like, the fact of the matter is, like, a lot of people will want to move because there's no capital there. But actually, when those people move, a few people will stay because they like their homes. And then the small amount of access to jobs they have there, they'll be able to actually fill. Their quality of life will get better as well. Then they say that the labor shortage is because of ageism. I want to point this out, right? They say there's a labor shortage. They concede this, and by conceding that, they concede there is access to jobs and low-skill jobs for the people moving to these cities, right? They say it's because of ageism. I don't really understand this. I don't see how this is entirely connected to the case at all. They need to warrant a lot more to say like, how this affects ageism at all. So then they say they're going to cut funding to rural areas, but there was no funding in rural areas in the first place, right? Like, that's the problem. That's why the quality of life there is so poor. Xi was never funding these rural areas. So then I just want to remind you of our entire second contention, which goes cold conceded, not responded to at all. The fact of the matter is, right now, there are a lot of rural Chinese, again, who have physically moved to urban China, but who have not legally moved because of the hukou system, which is damn near impossible to get papers for, pardon my French, if you are a low-skilled worker. And so these people are living in absolute poverty. They're living without public education. They're living without access to health insurance, without access to maternity benefits. This is the reason their quality of life is so poor. And hukou is the most important internal internal migration restriction, I want to emphasize it is there because China has wanted to restrict internal migration that exists. By bringing in the government plan, we can get rid of the hookah system. We can make sure that people who already live in these cities have access to benefits, and we can make sure that people who want to move to these cities for more jobs, because to escape the terrible economy of rural China, will be able to do so. China benefits, Chinese people benefit everywhere. We are just strong government ballot. Thank you for your time.
Okay. For off-time roadmap, I'm going to do some like off-case analysis. So if you're flowing on paper, you can just put that on a new sheet, and then I'll just go gov case, then op case. Yeah, I'll start my time now. So starting with some off-case analysis, which I just want to like highlight what the government exactly is arguing for. We think there are two really like possibilities that happen when they abolish the restrictions on internal migration. One, which we think is the most likely thing, is that we don't actually think people from rural areas are going to move. Why is this true? We tell you people for several reasons. One, that farmers in the status quo don't have the income to move to large cities. Government needs a plan for how these people are going to literally afford the trip to the large city. And we think that like the government plan will largely only have an impact on the remaining skilled workers in rural areas because those are the only ones who have the ability to move, literally just like monetarily speaking. The second reason why we don't think rural people are going to move is because farmers don't feel like they have the right skill set. They don't feel confident in the job, not right now, sorry. They don't feel confident in the job market in urban China because they've been working as a farmer their entire life. And the idea for them that they can get a job in like an urban factory or something like that, even if it might be true, but regardless of whether or not it's true, we think there's going to be a perception of like, we don't know if our skill set is going to apply to urban jobs, and that's going to discourage them from moving. The third reason why we think this is not true is we think generally people in poverty are probably quite risk averse. Like the chance that they come there and come into like extreme economic prosperity, yeah, that might exist, but we think they're probably thinking a lot more of like, what if I leave my entire family behind for nothing? What if I don't get a job there? What if I'm not making any money there? And we think all of these are like legitimate concerns, but regardless of whether or not you think they're legitimate concerns, I'll take your POI at the end of this, at the end of my off case thing. Regardless of whether or not you think this is a legitimate concern, we think this is definitely going to be a calculus going through people's head. And the idea that farmers are just going to like up and move is like completely unfounded in the government case. Even if farmers do just up and move, we tell you that this means the quality of life gets so much worse in cities, right? You have these influx of people. And if you buy what they tell you about like farmers in the status quo not using the systems available in urban cities, then buy this warrant, which is that when farmers start using the systems available in cities, that these systems are not prepared to handle this influx of people, which they paint on government side, which means they literally aren't getting access to the benefits, which government calls so important. And nobody's getting access to the benefits anymore because these systems break down. So even the original like urban workers who have been living in cities their entire life, who are used to these benefits, who are counting on the government to receive an education for their children and all that stuff, are no longer getting these benefits because there are just too many people in the system, can't handle it anymore. So that's bad. The second thing we tell you is bad if a ton of rural migrants come to cities is we tell you that this just in general drives wages down. Why is this true? I mean, government concedes themselves that rural people have been being paid so much less than urban people. When they come there expecting a salary almost half of that of what the urban people are working for, we tell you that like people that are hiring have a unique incentive to hire rural people for this lower price, which means urban people are going to lose their jobs. And in general, wages are going to go down, which leads to a decreased quality of life for everyone. And furthermore means like if the only way rural people are being hired is for working for the same wages they were working for in the rural communities, means they haven't increased the quality of life at all, right? Government needs to prove that there's a unique benefit on their side, and they haven't done that yet. They bring up this idea of like, yeah, there's a labor shortage so many times in their speech. We think that the labor shortage is so small. Like the labor shortage only exists in these really big cities, and the labor shortage is something around 5%. The unemployment rate in China in general is huge. And we think that like if everybody goes to if every rural person goes to an urban community expecting a job, the unemployment the amount of jobs that don't have workers doing them right now is just going to be like so quickly filled, and you're going to have all these people in cities which no longer have the infrastructure to support them, not having anywhere to work. So they really don't have the guaranteed benefits to any of this. We don't think this sort of system can support this, and we think like obviously empirically speaking, the unemployment in China far outweighs the few amount of jobs that don't have people in it anymore. The last thing I want to talk about here is just in terms of like labor economics. In general, we think it's far better to have a slight slight less amount of workers and slight more amount of jobs, because that drives labor like wages up, as opposed to having so many laborers in cities and so few jobs that they're competing for. That generally drives wages down, and we think that's generally bad, especially for a country which they know in their own case is already like on net having so much less like annual income than other countries. I'll take one of your POS now.
Wouldn't you say that the majority of migrants, like international and national, are poor people searching for employment?
Yeah, but I don't think that takes into account all the people who have stayed in rural areas because they're scared of moving. So like, I don't really think that matters. The numbers that you're looking at fully don't take into account all the people who have stayed in rural China. Why do we think they've stayed? I have like warranting on this as well. They probably have family there. That farm has probably been in their family for a really long time. It's part of their tradition. It's part of their culture. They're probably scared of moving. Like all of your analysis on the rural people that have already moved to cities doesn't really apply here, because we're talking about the people who have not moved and why they would be incentivized to move under the system in which it's now legal. And I don't think that's something that you grapple with in your case. Moving on to their first contention, again, they talk a lot about jobs and income, like just cross-apply all the off-case stuff that I just gave you. But we tell you in response to their thing about wages, A, that wages are going to be cut, and B, that rural life is a lot cheaper than urban life. That this doesn't take this into account. Like in general, it just costs more to buy a hot dog in New York City than it does in Kansas. We don't think lack of access is unique to the government side. Again, like when these systems are overloaded, they just functionally do not work anymore. There are plenty of examples of places in which public services are provided to citizens, but are basically non-functional, like the public school system in New York City. While provided, and while some schools are great, there are a lot of schools that are just completely in disrepair, and people there aren't getting education anyways. Also, furthermore, we tell you that like their analysis doesn't really take into account that plenty of people in rural China could be being homeschooled by their parents, and that like practical information in terms of like how to farm and stuff like that is still like a skill in life. They don't take this into account. Moving on down to their second contention, they talk about the status quo and the migrant laws. Again, we tell you it's highly unlikely that the urban poor and urban population, highly likely that the urban poor will not be happy. This discrimination will still happen. There are probably going to be a lot of like hatred in between these two groups. We see this in like America when like the Irish started coming and working for lower wages than the people that were already in America. We think this sows division between groups, and we think this is generally bad, especially if we recognize that like Xi Jinping is running a corrupt regime, and we think that workers need to probably be united in order to make any progress against him. I'm not going to take any more point of informations. We tell you all of this is going to get so much worse if people move. Like the reason that the government does this is so that they can spend less money. They don't want to spend more money. Moving on to the opposition case just really quickly. They tell you that like people don't want, they talk about like the culture shock. We actually tell you the culture shock of moving from rural to urban is probably way bigger than the culture shock of moving from rural China to like rural Africa or something like that. And furthermore, you're coming with a bunch of other Chinese migrants, which means your culture is still going to be there. You could come with your family. You're staying in a rural place. You basically know what's happening. Your wages are insured, and the Chinese government is literally paying for you to go there. They tell you that this is not how the Belt and Road Initiative works. Again, we tell you this is not true. Like basically the reason why the Belt and Road Initiative works this way is because Xi Jinping made promises about giving people jobs. And in the status quo, we see he has come up with a system to combat the fact that there's so much unemployment in China, which is exporting Chinese labor to these developing countries. And we talk about why this is good under our second contention. Yeah, I think this is really all I have to say. Most of our warrants are really never responded to. Look at the impacts of like moving all the talent, why this is uniquely worse for the people that remain in rural areas, and why since there are so many people in rural China, just weigh this out on magnitude. I think it's a pretty clear opposition ballot. Thank you.
Okay. Once again, anything you have to say, just say it verbally. If I don't acknowledge you, just like repeat it or say it again. This is going to be completely off flow. Going to do like really quickly some framing and then just go into weighing mechanisms as to why I think the opposition wins the round. So I would float on a separate piece of paper. If everybody, then I am going to begin my time. No, we think that there are two main ways this like actually works out when we sort of lift this ban on everything and it abolishes, right? Like either a bunch of rural poor move or they don't, right? Like what happens if they move? The government has absolutely no impact. Everything stays like pretty much exactly the same. And their case falls. My partner gives you like some warning as to why we think it's possible that they don't move, right? Like they like their families, they're scared, they're risk averse, et cetera, et cetera. If you buy any of this, we think that we probably win, given the government has the burden of proof to prove that they are like actually creating some sort of change. And if you believe that like things like generally aren't changing, in fact, like it's probably just going to be easier for like skilled workers to leave, which is bad for the rural poor, as they tell you and as we tell you. We think that like we are getting the net negative impacts of like affecting the rural community when even more skilled laborers leave because they don't have to get their permits, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that they like don't have access to a lot of the impacts that they present to you. But if you don't believe that and you think that like a lot of farmers are moving significantly, I'm going to do some weighing under this as well, right? We tell you this is going to be worse for A, the urban poor, B, the rural poor, and C, everybody living in urban communities, right? First, poor, right? We tell you that all of the people still living in rural poor will have a significantly decreased quality of life, right? Like unless literally everybody is moving to urban areas, which we think is also going to be bad, but I'll get into that in a second. We think there are going to be people left in poverty. My opponents say like, no, they'll just take the jobs that are left behind, but they don't tell you like what these jobs are, where they're magically appearing from, or how they're making like a significant amount of money that is going to fix all of the issues they present to you about like not having social services and things like that in rural poverty. We think that actually like when more people are leaving the rural poor, it's way less likely that in the future like they will get any sort of social services, because then there are less people living there. There's less like incentive to actually do anything about this because there's a smaller population and they don't have as much political capital or anything like that. We think this is getting significantly worse for the rural poor while they're actually not fixing anything for people living in rural poverty on their side. They get no impacts here, but we get the net negative of decreasing the quality of life for them because they have like less political capital just from significantly having less people. Even if you don't believe this, we think that all of the people moving to the urban areas and the people already living there will also have a significantly decreased quality of life, right? Why? First, there's going to be an influx of unskilled laborers into cities. What does this mean? A mass influx of people that have access of the benefits that they say exist in cities, right? We tell you that urban people currently may have access to some sort of social services, but the reason Xi doesn't have social services in rural areas is because he doesn't want to spend more money, right? Like this is probably why he's doing this. He doesn't want to spend more Chinese capital. We think that if more people move to urban areas and sort of overrun the social services because there's going to be a mass influx that they aren't prepared to handle, it's way more likely that he's going to cut these for not only the people that are currently living there, but all of the people that are moving there. And they're not actually going to have the capital or ability to like handle and do this for all of the people that are moving there. They're not actually going to have access to all of the social services my opponents present to you that they will. It's likely that they'll be overrun. They won't be able to like have all of this mass influx of people. And it's likely that they'll actually like shut down or like not be able to hold it, and therefore nobody gets access to them. There's also going to be a mass wage lowering because there are enough laborers now that they no longer have to pay, because they know that if they cut their wages and those people quit, there's other laborers that are like willing and able to come work for them for a lower price compared to whatever they were doing.
Sorry, stop the time. This was actually before the labor point, but the point that he's going to cut funding to urban areas is new. We hear that he's going to cut funding to rural areas in MO, but the point about cutting funding to urban areas is entirely new. New analysis, not neither constructive, must be disregarded.
It was brought up in my own first speech. I talk about the fact that social services in urban areas are going to get worse. It's also brought up in my partner's offlow, I believe, and also when she responds to one of your contentions, not exactly sure which, but whichever one you guys talk about, like labor shortages and things like that, or like social services, she also responds with this rebuttal, but the judges can take it under consideration. And I will begin my time again. Now, they say that they're fixing a labor shortage and that like we quote unquote concede this, but they miss like a major point of what I say. And then my partner like clears this up for you pretty clearly, right? Like the labor shortage is small and unemployment in rural China is really high, right? So like this is not actually just fixing it. It's like a band-aid solution where there's going to be way more workers than like the quote unquote labor shortage, which we tell you is pretty small. Even if you think that we are fixing a labor shortage and there's going to be like a perfect amount of people migrating that's just going to perfectly like fix this quote unquote labor shortage, we think that in the long term, when these people have kids, when these people have more people migrate, et cetera, there's going to be so many more in the future that we're like, even if this problem exists in the status quo, in the future, it's just going to get worse. We get all of the impacts we tell you. We also think that it's highly likely that urban populations won't be happy and discrimination will still happen, right? Government just negatively impacts more people. They negatively impact the people in the city, lower wages, worse public service. They negatively impact the remaining rural poor because they can't, it's probably a lot of people, even for fewer skilled laborers, and they can't provide services. So even if the people who go from rural to urban and get jobs and benefit from social services, like even if these people exist, they are quite clearly the smallest group. So we win on all of this magnitude weighing. For all these reasons, I urge an off ballot. Thank you.
Okay. Coming out of the op block, it seems as though op can't pick a narrative. Are the only people moving going to be the rich, educated people? Or are the only people moving going to be unskilled laborers that overcrowd provinces like Shanghai? We don't really know. So let me talk a little bit about what this plan will realistically do, and then I will get into my two voting issues. Basically, we tell you that some poor people are going to move from rural China to urban China. Let's look at what's happening in the status quo. In the status quo, rich and educated people under the current policy are able to legally move to cities. This is because the cities want them. So this changes absolutely nothing when it comes to brain drain because these people can already easily move. And this was clearly illustrated in my first speech. Now, let's look at poor people. Poor people move all the time. The people who are most incentivized to move are poor people. But their whole thing about some people aren't going to want to move, sure, that just works for us because it shows that some poor people are going to move, not massive amounts or anything that's going to cause any sort of overcrowding. And basically what you get is certain poor rural Chinese people able to move and get the benefits from the city. That's kind of all that's happening here. And I want to make it very clear. The opposition is advocating for a world in which people living in cities earn upwards of 43,000 won a year, while people in rural areas earn 17,000 won a year. They're advocating for a world in which out of the 61 million kids in rural China, only 59 million of them do not attend school. And people who have no access to utilities like running water and proper heating. And they don't tell you anything about how this is improving right now. They tell you, oh, it's going to take away all these resources. What resources? Quality of life in rural China is absolutely terrible, and they give you no reason to believe that it is going to improve. Now, what the government does is we propose an out to this. We propose an out for those people living in rural China who want to make a life better for themselves and that don't want to move to Africa. So with that, let's get into the voting issues. First, let's talk about quality of life for people living in rural areas. Basically, people can now move from rural China into a place with more job opportunities, with an actual labor shortage rather than high unemployment, and a place where their kids can get educated. This will just lead to a higher quality of life for them overall. Now, they talk about brain drain. However, we tell you that this is not impacted because educated people can move right now. And if anything, it'll create a better quality of life because with this plan, more people can go to cities, which increases the probability that people will go back to their homeland and be a doctor there. They also talk about political will going away, but we tell you that there's no political will right now because the situation is not improving in any way, shape, or form. So when you're evaluating this argument, we believe that it should be your first priority because we are prioritizing quality of life for the most vulnerable, the rural Chinese people. And with this argument, you see the highest probability that some good will happen. The logic chain here is just the most simple. People now actually have the opportunity to go and live where they want, and they can make a better life for themselves where they can get educated and make higher wages. And we believe that you should be weighing on probability over everything else because you have the biggest reason to believe that this is what happens. Now, let's look at quality of life for people in urban China. We tell you that with anything else, at the very least, all of the people who are rural migrants in cities right now who don't have social security benefits get those under our plan. But let's look at a few more specificities. Basically, people can move into urban China and they can now get the actual benefits from urban China rather than not being able to have access to these benefits. They talk about overcrowding and overloading the system. However, there's a few things that are wrong with this. Basically, the net same amount of people are within this Chinese quote unquote system. So what they're doing with this argument is they're either conceding that rural people are not getting benefits in the status quo because they're out of this system fully, or they're conceding that rural people are getting benefits and the system is capable of taking care of all of these people and that there's no risk to overcrowding whatsoever because it's the same amount of people in whatever said national system. So basically what you can see is that lifting this, it is inevitable that people that are currently living in urban China that came from rural China who don't get access to benefits right now will have access to benefits. They'll have access to like maternity leave and unemployment, which will make it a lot easier for them to go seek employment or, like do whatever else they need to do, like take care of their dying grandma or something like that. So because you see that a moderate amount of poor people are going to move into cities, these people are going to have access to employment, have access to education, and have access to social safety nets under the plan, I strongly urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Great round. Thank you.
Around, guys.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This was a great round, very enjoyable to watch and adjudicate. Very big achievement to be here. On a 3-0 consensus decision, we voted for the government. I'll briefly talk about why. So there are two characterizations of whether or not a lot of people move or very few people move. I think in the world in which very few people move, then the gov is just winning because it means that you lack a lot of the harms that Op talks about while also uniquely having the ability to solve some degree of labor shortage, but also give people who are currently in the cities access to social welfare programs. There are a lot of reasons to believe that not very many people move. First, at the top of PMC, we're told that this policy will be relatively gradual, which means that literally tomorrow you don't just have millions of people moving. But secondly, there's a lot of MO characterization for why very few people will move. So I think the round just goes to gov there. If we're adjudicating on the idea of a lot of poor people moving, then I think that this is where the debate gets a lot messier. I think a lot of the judges are going to agree with that, but I think that it can narrowly go towards gov here. So even if a lot of poor people do move, there are a couple of indictments that opposition makes. The first is to say that there's going to be a major drain of skill because people who are currently in these rural communities come to the cities and there aren't skilled workers here. The problem is that we get two arguments from MG that say that A, these people have already left because they've already been allowed to move, which means that B, even if there's some relative and comparative privilege, which I think Op is right to point out, that degree of privilege is relatively small. And so the underlying demographic characteristics of the people who are in the rural communities are relatively similar. So there's not going to be this major drain. The second indictment is that there's going to be a drain of money and capital. If it's the case that we don't think there's a huge amount of money and capital here already, then that drain is also not going to be problematic. And the same sort of problems also sort of indict the problems of like political power going away. The other argument that Op gives that takes some time to evaluate is the idea of, will you overwhelm social welfare programs that are in the cities? But one, if the policy is gradually implemented, then you don't just suddenly have the program going bust tomorrow. I buy that, if people are gradually moving to cities and then contributing to the economic potential of that city, then the city would ostensibly have more revenue, and then that revenue could fund the social welfare program. But two, even if that's not true, PMR gives this really clever weighing, which is that if opposition is right, that social programs go bust, the implicit, concession you're making is that that's because the people lack the social welfare programs in the first place. And so then the only thing that you're weighing is it better to have a few people having really incredible social welfare programs, or is it better to have more people having some degree of social welfare programs? I think the latter is just more compelling on the account of net benefits framework of just helping more people to some degree. That's sort of how I saw the round. I thought it was a really great round. I think my biggest piece of feedback would be all of these speeches were really, really great, but having a clear characterization of how many people do we think are going to move, and then just agreeing on that in the round would have made it a lot easier for both teams and sort of made it harder for your impacts to just get delinked on the framing level because you would have had a really consistent narrative.
Who else is a judge? Oh, Kyle, do you want to go?
Sure, happy to. Also, hey, Mark, nice to see you. Nice to judge alongside you. I co-sign everything that Emmanuel said. I thought that was a really cogent and comprehensive RFD. I think that I completely agree with the analysis coming out of MG. I think there's just there's a really clear narrative about, who is incented to move, who isn't, where are those people likely to move, who are those people. And I think that narrative just kind of stays true on the flow throughout the course of the debate. And so I think realistically, I buy that on a scale of 1 to 100 hypothetical people that move, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 20, not 90 and 100. And so insofar as I think that Gov is very cleanly winning benefits on the improvement of quality of life of rural to urban migrants in a world in which that movement is like both gradual and small. Again, agreeing with like the analysis Emmanuel gave and the characterization of the Gov plan. I think that a lot of the harms that Op talks about just are like relatively implausible. The only thing that may be a little bit different in how I saw the round and how I adjudicated is I thought like the very clean, like highest probability, highest confidence RFD for me that just was like not contested at all was this really smart argument that comes out in MG, which basically tells me that, yeah, even though it's illegal in the status quo for rural people to migrate to the city, there still are like, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands that have done that. If you change this policy, that group of people will immediately benefit in a real intangible way. And so, insofar as that's like not anywhere near like the magnitude of people that would trigger, I think, like the potential offense around, resource drain, like labor market distortion, and that's just such a clear like short-term net benefit that's uncontested. I like predominantly sign the Gov ballot there first and foremost, but agree with like the gist of Emmanuel's RFE as well. Good round.
From my point of view, there were three things that carried the day for Gov. I thought the MG PMR was really well executed and felt like just a steel trap on the round. So first of all, Gov basically establishes that the status quo in rural China sucks. And I think that's just not really contested by Op. And so the fact that, and they made this point in the PM speech, in the original PM speech as well, that only a small percentage of rural China is currently educated or has health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. I have no idea whether any of this is true. But if it is true, then it's kind of try or die for rural China, right? It's like, how bad could any change be for rural China if everything is bad right now? The second thing is the brain drain is going to happen anyway point that the PMR makes. I mean, I don't know. That almost was a new argument, but like, or maybe it wasn't, but it was so good that it was like, it made me as a dopey parent judge just feel like, oh, yeah. That's like a gimmick trick that I feel really good about. So I thought that was a very powerful point. And then Kai's point that the illegal immigrants, the undocumented immigrants that are currently in urban China that aren't getting benefits, that they'll get benefits from this. I don't think Op like addressed that enough. I felt like that was like a pretty likely substantial gain of the Gov position. And then, a few other thoughts. I think that Op needed to really make it clear that urbanization is a disaster and that there's this market failure going on, that letting people vote with their feet, even though that's freedom, is really bad for China. And that urbanization is a crisis. And I'm actually surprised Op didn't say anything about COVID, which I think might have worked. That, there's been this discontinuity with the pandemic and maybe having everybody in cities is no good. But if rural China really is bad, then you needed to have some argument that urbanization is worse than we even know.
I agree.
Yeah. So in any event, that was my net take, which I think is consistent with the other two judges.
Congratulations again. It's a great round.
Thank you. Good luck, guys.
Good luck, guys.
Recording stopped.
Thank you guys so much, and good job being here, and thank you for the fun debate. Thank you.
Bye.